Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session, which is going to be an interesting panel between me, Mario, and Christofer on a very interesting topic, which is, we have some personal experience on this. We want to share and swap ideas and talk about, some interesting directions, which is basically the sort of the value of the CTO, CISO, and how to make it work, which is, this interesting proposition of when a person takes basically the responsibility of not just security but also of technology. So maybe just quick round of intros. So I'm Dinis Cruz. I'm actually have two jobs at the moment. I'm the chief scientist of Glasswall and I'm the CISO of Holland & Barrett. But when I was at Glasswall, my previous role was actually CTO and CISO. Maybe Mario, quick intro from you.
Yep, I'm Mario Platt. So I'm a CISO at a consulting company called Broadlight Global, and I also lead the security consulting practice. So I have interim and fractional CISO roles with a number of different companies, mainly in fintech and other industries.
Cool.
And Hoff.
Yep. Hi, Christofer Hoff. Just call me Hoff, and I am the combined CTO and CSO. So I just made that the CSTO, Chief Secure Technology Officer at LastPass, since when we started thinking about what we really care about from an outcomes perspective, it's what do my customers care about? They care that the products and services they get, the technology that they get is secure. So combining the two gives you the opportunity to provide both of those levels of service at the level that they expect. So
cool. So why don't we start with you, Hoff? Because that actually, your title is interesting because you actually have secure technology officer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is an interesting twist on the CTO and CISO. So
yeah.
Can you just explain how you got there, and if you came from more of a security or more from an engineering sort of path?
So I think to answer that question, I'll address it from a set of experiences, both good and bad, I suppose, from both being and working in startups, upstarts, and large multinational Fortune 10 companies, where coming from a security background, but also working in companies that develop secure technologies or security technologies has always put me in this weird Venn diagram of being in roles where I could inform or influence the outcomes in terms of product development, but I might have only owned the operational elements of it, or pieces about the security side, not the technology. And if we look at the complaints that many in the security industry and community have lodged about bolting security on versus building it in those influencer roles, you sort of get to help bolt stuff on, but it may not be, from an engineering and product delivery perspective, job number one. And you can imagine why that is the case. Their job is to potentially build, develop, and make available products. And so this was the sort of culmination for me of about 30 years of getting super excited but super frustrated by being able to see things that are obvious, and or at least obvious to me, and obvious challenges in the ways in which technology is being developed and deployed and productized. And especially in security companies, where if you look at the number of vulnerabilities that come out with respect to security products, it's pretty astounding, right? So that means that if you have a traditional CISO who has an SDLC and vulnerability management and everything else they're supposed to be doing, yet you still end up with, the OWASP top 10, which hasn't changed in 200 years. And yes, that's an exaggeration. But we see, stupid human tricks being repeated over and over again. And so I looked at this opportunity and said, look, I want to be able to do both. And there's some pros and cons to that as we'll go through. But that's how I arrived there, by being able to look. They had an open CISO position. They had an open CTO position. And I said, boy, do I have a deal for you. And here I am. So
you got two salaries? I'm not sure.
I wish. No, that was the part where I'm not the CFO, so the whole financial piece I really screwed up on. No, I'm just kidding. I get paid. I get paid nicely for the job that I signed up to do, and it was less about the pay and more about the opportunity. To be quite frank, because it just doesn't. This sort of thing doesn't happen a lot.
Yeah.
This panel wouldn't be interesting because there'd be lots of people doing that job, right? So
Mario, what's your views on these two roles?
Yeah, so I think generally one of the main things that that need to be kind of agreed is the organization actually having a shared goal, right? Because I think one of the challenges that most organizations face, I particularly see that with the companies that I work with, is that we always seem to be kind of hitting each other between an approach that is based on bureaucratic accountability and another one that is focused on adding operational value from the work of security, right? And when you've got people usually dealing with the roles completely separate, which is the normal thing that happens in organizations, you have this constant headbutting between them, right? Usually because people that are tasked with the bureaucratic accountability may not really understand the constraints and trade-offs that drive the engineering decisions. Right. So I think that part on getting an organization or a leader that has an interest in an understanding of both spaces actually puts someone in the position to understand what those goal conflicts are and make informed decisions based on the goals that they signed up to the organization, right? As opposed to the systems of bureaucratic accountability that they have put in place on, now you need to sign this risk here because you're doing something that I think goes against a bad practice or is not a good practice, right? And it kind of sidesteps that process. But obviously, one of the things that I would say to that is there are probably not that many individuals out there with a level of skill that is required to do this job well, right? To have those two hats on. So that maybe it probably doesn't make it a universally applicable pattern, but I think that in some situations, in particular contexts, it's probably the best thing to do for a lot of places. I do have the experience of, so in the consulting work that I do, of kind of doing first one and then the other. Because that's one of the things that I usually for companies around 100 people, etc. Which is if I come in to help a client, and I've done this with one of the fintech clients that I'm working with. When I started working with them, they really had nothing in terms of good policies that were based on actual engineering practice. They didn't have risk management or risk register and all of those. So I started initially by working with them, reporting to the COO, who was also the CFO, and helping them build that system of bureaucratic accountability, right? And then once that job was done, it was I had already built a good relationship with the CTO. It was, look, now that we are going to focus more on the next stage of the thing, which is adding the operational security value onto the team, I think it would make more sense for me to be a direct report to you instead, so that I can work closely with your direct reports, with your teams, and kind of be involved more on the daily stuff so that they can help build the security from the ground up, as opposed to kind of being on the side of the bean counter, right? On the CFO, COO side, that is more worried about how much it's going to cost, etc. That would make it for a poor organizational dynamic on how I can actually provide that value and how people are willing to listen to my opinion, right? Which is the other part of the puzzle.
So what about you, Dinis? You're not allowed to ask and answer your own questions. So now we're going to turn it over to you and say, tell us about your background and how at Glasswell you had both of those titles and or accountability and responsibilities.
Yeah, so I think I've always, well, I came from a development background, right? So I got into security by hacking my way into the job, but you know, and I started with pen testing, with all that, even scanning the internet. I remember buying the first copy of Hacking Exposed, right? And then let's say page 10, cool, scan the internet for DNS, cool, let's see how it works. So it was a great learning experience. But I always felt that I've always built stuff. I always have an approach of building things. And Mario was kind of involved in some of the projects. I was the pure CISO, and I was still building things. So I feel that I have a very natural attraction to engineering, and I always found that. And this is an advice I would give to a lot of our peers, a lot of the people that are coming up in the security industry, right? It's very valuable to stay technical, very long in your career. So I made a very conscious decision, in my late 20s and 30s, not to go into management, because I wanted to keep being very technical. So that means that when I go into management, I was still one of the most technical persons in the room. And that has a big advantage because, allows you to build things, allows you to have a much better understanding of what's going on. So then, when the sort of the Glasswell opportunity came along, it was very interesting because, they kind of needed, the lead of engineering, but I actually understood security, understood technology. So for me, that was a great opportunity to kind of come and I actually started as a VP of engineering. So I was actually CISO VP of engineering, and I guess I promoted myself into being a CTO, right? By delivering a bunch of things, in a way to show that you could do it, because I agree with Mario that, that you do need to have a bit of expertise. But I do think there's a lot more people who can do it. I think, if you look at the interesting thing I found is that we, from a security, we have a different point of view on things. And I really found that our definition of what's possible is very different than most engineering teams and most even, senior engineering execs, definition of what's possible. Because we in security, we're so used to go under the hood. We're so used to go, okay, if this is possible, then that is possible, then that is possible, then that is possible. And I found that in engineering, we in fact, we experience this from the other side, because sometimes we recommend things and there's a bit of an attrition. And I found that even when I was leading that part, there was still an attrition, right? It was still an attrition not to embrace certain ideas, not to do certain things, is not supposed to work. That's not how things are supposed to work, right? How many times I heard that? Well, that's not how it works. I'm like, well, I don't care. It's like, this is a better solution, right? So I think, there's a lot of value in engineering, and these days I'll highly recommend any security executive to also have a stint at running things, because it will learn so much about how to get things done, what really matters, in fact, and where security can add a huge amount of value, right? I found myself sometimes making security decisions that really help engineering, and then vice versa, right? And it was a great way to push a lot of things that in the past it would just be slower to be adopted.
There's so many things to unpack in the couple of things you just said, but let me sort of summarize a couple of really interesting points that just the light bulbs went on as you said that. So, a lot of the focus in security is the break pieces versus the build, and it's security is thought about as a sort of juxtaposed service with separation of duties, to where somebody else builds it. Your job is to inform them and tell them how easy it is to break so they can make stronger products, etc. I think one of the values of thinking about this, and usually I think the dividing line is the size of the company and also how regulated the environment is. Yeah. But I've been a security CTO twice before, large networking security company and a large financial services company. And we built as much as we bought when I ran the security engineering team, because a lot of the products simply couldn't scale to the level, security products couldn't scale to the level that we needed. And so there were other parts of the security organization that acted as checkpoints, as frame rails or guardrails against my ability to make sure I was congruent and aligned to policies, etc. But at the same point in time, as we took that approach and we expanded it out to the stakeholders that the security team writ large was supposed to service, it was more about almost trotting down that path that people, I think, say today, which is very cliche, that security should be a business enabler. Yeah. I'm like, okay, if we accept that as the premise, whatever that means, and you start looking at the structure organizationally of your security team, I will anecdotally quote data that I have, or anecdata, which in this case is the plural of data, given my lack of citation, to suggest that most of those security organizations don't do much enabling, or if they are enablers in the negative sense, in as much as they focus on the break, not the build. So I really liked what you said about taking an engineering building mindset, the development background, if you happen to have one, into engineering. The thing that I think we should talk about here is I don't disagree that more people actually have the ability. And in fact, the great part about this job is the imposter syndrome that comes along with the fact that because I wasn't a developer, but I have development background, I understand both sides of the teams, running engineering and product engineering and security, because I think of it as, to what Mario said, I care about the outcomes. Secure technology, right? Hence the title. So what do you all think about this, the availability of roles like this for people that aren't developers but have security background? I mean, what are the set of skills needed to become somebody that leads both efforts?
I don't think, look, I don't think it needs to be a developer, right? I think sometimes we equate being technical with being a developer. Look, I happen to have that skill, but that's not the main thing, right? I think you need to be good at technology, good at engineering, good at building things. If you can break things apart, if you know how to connect the dots, if you know how to create good roadmaps and make good visions and make good decisions for the team, you can be a good CTO, right? And I think in security, right, we tend to do that. Like you said, a lot of security teams, they're already engineering. They just don't call themselves like that. Like, if that's the thing, if you work for a bigger company and you go, well, you're running a team of 20, 30, 40 people building shit stuff, guess what? That's how it's big as a startup, right? Like you don't, a startup won't have more than 20, 30, 40 engineers, right? Unless you do what I did and I go to Upwork and build a massive team. But the reality is that it's, I think a lot of people could do it, at that level. And the thing I just wanted to say, which I think is interesting, is that we in security really embrace that being an enabler, and I think we do, right? I think we should stop talking about it from a security point of view, because these days just about every good security team is an enabler. But what's very interesting is that very other few business functions are enablers. So one of the things I also find interesting is that when I was basically from a CTO point of view, I found myself trying to do the same thing. Hey, I want to enable the business. I want to enable the sales guys. I want to enable that team. I took the same approach to the function, because I felt, well, our job is to enable that crowd, right? That's the point of things. But it's interesting because when you look at even big organizations, you think, well, why doesn't HR or the finance or that team or that team or that team also has sometimes the same approach? Because they have a massive impact, right, on the business. But can we bring Alan? Because Alan is an interesting player here. What's your thoughts so far? Maybe just talk a quick intro, Alan, and then share your thoughts so far.
Right, I'm going to get it out there straight off. I'm not technical. My degree was electronic systems engineering, and I didn't finish it because it wasn't my bag. But it's given me a good understanding of the questions to ask and how to interpret the answers to go to the next level of questioning. And that's how I've played it in a CISO role, but I would never go for a CTO role. I'd rather work with somebody who is more technical. Forgive me, Mario, Dinis, I've watched what the two of you have done and have admired it, knowing it's not my bag. But to your point, I think there are more out there in what I would call the technical CISO stream. And I think Deloitte coined that first, such as Andy Borer, for example. There are others out there. And I think there will be more, given that's where a lot of the talent in cyber is coming from, that technical engineering side. But I don't. I'm ex-military. I think of myself as a generalist. My first job was physical security, looking after nuclear weapons security for the Royal Air Force, and I've just declined a call from Nick Coleman. That's going to cost me. But anyway, and I've moved through the security pillars, physical, personnel, into information security before we called it cyber. And I've now been in commerce nearly as long as I was in the Air Force operational. So next year is going to be a milestone for me. But I've been a CISO the wrong side of a breach. I've been a consultant both with IBM Security, SIs, and an independent for the last 3 years. And I absolutely recognize what Dinis, you and Mario are talking about in terms of size of company. Because if you're less than 100, you can't afford the overhead of a second line of defense. You've got to have your first line straddling both, because you need the operational side. I loved Mario's with the bureaucratic security overlaid, but anyway, I love that, because they can't afford it. I mean, when I was CISO in residence at Cylon Labs for 3 years, it was clear that all of them were thinking about their product, what their product could do, the problem that they were trying to solve. They weren't thinking about how they were going to secure their product so that it could go into an enterprise environment without adding more risk. They hadn't given it a moment's thought. And that's kind of where I spent most time prodding them. because that's what they needed to do. They needed to look after, sorry, my military parlance here, they needed to look after their six because they weren't watching it at all. They were just looking forward. So that's kind of my stance, I think. You know, I make no bones about it. I'm probably almost the opposite of yourselves in terms of I sit in that GRC SecOps facing to the business and working with a CTO, but I'd rather work with a CTO than a CIO because I'm more often than not calling the CIO out for cutting corners. To Mario's point, you know, I'm looking for the areas where things are going to fail because my eye is on resilience. I don't want to bring a product to market that's just going to break. That doesn't make sense to me, and it's going to damage our reputation. So yeah, that's probably the angle I'm coming at this conversation from.
Cool. Mario.
So, yeah, I would add something there. So what I mentioned previously with regards to the approach on the bureaucratic accountability or operational value. I think if we bring that up kind of a level down, I think it's a relevant framing to talk about the enablement part of it, right? Because as a control function, just like HR, for instance, you would probably see a lot of people that HR teams that say they are in some way enabling the business, but that the employees don't necessarily feel that HR as a department has their best interests in mind, right? And this thing that we do here called security, right? This is not just a thing that like we looked at it 20, 30 years ago, where we kind of throw a couple of controls over the fence and that's it, that's the job done, right? It's actually something that that needs to be part of the thinking and the practices, the social practices that team members have into some way, shape or form. And if we think of enablement as a requirement setting, right? We are setting the right requirements to support that system of bureaucratic accountability, as opposed to kind of a team topology's view of enablement, which is more we are providers of capability and facilitators of knowledge, right? Which is more kind of the operational value side of things at the other level. I think there's kind of something within that dynamic, right, of what the security team not only sees themselves as doing for the organization, but also what are the actual services or the functions that they bring into the fore to kind of make those words enablement, what that actually means. I think that's kind of where the trick is, or kind of that a different focus will probably lead you to different types of outcomes.
Yeah. Hoff, you want to comment on that?
You know, I would love to have a debate that would probably take an entire hour on something that Alan alluded to and Mario explicitly described, which is the notion of first, second, third line of defense, separation of duties, etc. So I think as human beings, we naturally gravitate towards, we'll call them guidelines of bureaucracy, because they give us sort of a view on, at a minimum, the guardrails to be able to operate in a framework that somebody else can measure whether you're operating appropriately within. What's really interesting, though, is that if you take an outcomes-driven approach, which is whether or not the thing that the entity as a whole produces and that the people that you build it for consume, you know, the really interesting concern I have is that we have, while Alan talked about the fact that many companies can't afford that separate set of capabilities, both from whether you decompose the security components and you have a separate GRC team and a separate incident response team and a separate this and a separate that. What's fascinating to me is that at the end of the day, if you measure a compliance framework, pick one, that says you must do these particular things versus generate a particular outcome, I worry about how absolutely overly bureaucratic we've become. Because Alan, you know, not that I don't know you that well, but I would suggest to you that saying that you're not technical is an interesting assertion. I think when you use the CTO example, you know, there are a minimum 4 different types of CTOs. There's a really good book, it's around here somewhere. It's really thick, but at the end of the day, it smushes down to basically the 4 types of CTOs. You've got the VP of engineering type, right? That's actually hands-on keyboard, sort of helps build and direct the product on a day-to-day basis. There's the equivalent of the field CTO that goes out and basically gets a bunch of, it's basically a fancy salesperson. There is the evangelist, which talks about sort of industry direction. And then there's the architect type. And those 4 examples are interesting because I'll bet you dollars to donuts that you're just as capable to perform probably 3 out of those 4 things based on your background to make a perfectly fine CTO. And why that ties back to the separation of duties piece is you don't have to be a hands-on keyboard to be a CTO, which goes back to the thing that Dinis and I were talking about. And my concern is that when people hear about the downside potentially to this role starts to come into effect when you're dealing with how regulated you are, whether you're a private or a public company, has nothing to do with, in many cases, the outcomes. It's like, oh, if you're highly regulated, the fact that regardless of the outcomes, that you don't have separations of duties versus the ability to provide transparency into decision makers and how decisions were made, we've so over-rotated to then think that we need such demarcation and bureaucratic alignment that we've sort of lost the plot. And that's not so much saying that I have an answer to it or that one is right and one is wrong, but I definitely think that there are a lot of people, you included, Alan, that could probably do this combined job, depending upon the type of organization that you're in. That's by the way, I didn't say that to make this a feel good Monday, but at the same point in time, I think I would have said the same thing about the job I'm in now. I sit down and write Rust or Erlang or PHP, Java? I probably could. You probably wouldn't want me to, but can I think from a systems design thinking and be able to ask questions and think like literally a hacker? Let's separate the sort of hacker component of being curious and understanding general technology constructs to be able to form theses about things in a systems design thinking. Absolutely. And that's why I winced when you said, I could never do that job. I don't know you, but I disagree.
So I know Alan, right? And I completely agree with Hoff analysis, right? I think he's spot on.
Okay, look, I'm not taking the blowing wind up my skirt piece, but I'm very conscious when I'm talking to this audience, I don't have the technical competence. But if I turn outwards to the other 99.5% of the world, yeah, I'm closer to the geeks than they are. And I'm very aware of that. So for me, it's about the audience. Who am I talking to? Because I am very wary of the imposter syndrome. I don't want to get called out for pretending to be what I'm not. So I would much rather play stupid and be able to ask an intelligent question than be the pretender who gets caught out because I don't know. It's a much more, I suppose actually it's a conservative approach, isn't it, with a small c. But yeah, look, it's about an audience thing. So actually, depending upon the level of that CTO in the organization, as in whether it is hands-on or whether it's in the board giving direction, if it's more of the latter, yes, I probably could make a fist of it. But I'd be coming at it from, I want to see secure by design, I want to see secure in build, and I want to see secure in operation. And by the way, let's think about how we're going to decommission and dispose as well. In other words, my approach would be very security centric, albeit with an understanding of engineering. You know, most of my Air Force friends were communications engineers or aircraft engineers because that's who I went through university with. And I'm still in touch with them 35 years later. You know, my security friends from the Air Force are actually fewer than my engineering friends, because in the RAF police, of which I was a part, they were more colleagues than friends, because we tended to operate in isolation just because of the nature of the beast. We didn't operate as a security team with lots of managers very often, because I was in a managerial role as an officer most of the time. So sorry, I'm just giving perhaps Christofer more of an insight into my background and why, given this audience, I came straight out with, I'm not technical. You know, I can absolutely make a claim to be a strategic CISO or a visionary CISO or even an operational CISO. I don't think I'd make a claim, certainly not in this audience, to be any of those technical leads, but I'm more than happy to work with and be a second head to bounce ideas between. Because one of the things, whether you're a CISO or a CTO, one of the things I am aware of is who do you bounce your ideas off with? Because you can't bounce them with other members of the board because they expect you to have the answers. If you start bouncing it off your number two, if you've got the luxury of a number two, he or she will be going, well, you're supposed to be the boss. Why are you asking me? You know, so there's a collaborative angle about having a CTO and a CISO that I have seen work. And I'm kind of interested in, Dinis, in terms of when you had, and indeed have, both hats, who do you bounce your ideas off? Because you can't bounce them off yourself without going nuts.
No, I bounced with the, with the team. Like, you said something that, you were afraid to be caught and make mistakes. Look, I do that all the time, right? I just, I always tell my team, like, and I don't think every idea I have is any good, right? Like, I think I have about an 80% good batting average and probably about 50 are good, right? But I use the team to, to find the right solution. Like, I think there's definitely some notes that you have to have a good instinct, or you have to have a good understanding, and I think you need to, learn from the industry. Like, the industry is not, it's quite wide open, right? You see other people doing stuff, right? You see a great pattern over there, and you go, well, that's exactly, if they did that, then that's a really cool thing that we need to operate. And those sometimes are your core principles. How it gets implemented, it actually depends on the team. So actually, even that's the interesting thing. Even when you're in charge, right? You can't, this idea that you can tell a team do this doesn't work like that, right? The team has to buy into the idea. I always try to say, like, yeah. I try to say, like, I try not to make a lot of decisions. I might keep coming at it, right? I might have a very strong opinion, but I try to always let the team get there, and sometimes let the team make mistakes, right? Or they prove you wrong, which is great, right? Like, either you prove it wrong and you learn, or they made a mistake, but now they've learned, and now you get to course adjust. But especially in a small team, I guess the part of the advantage of having the two roles, you can get stuff done, right? You learn,
yes, and
faster, and you interact, and in a weird way, the conflict of interest, gets absorbed a little bit by the fact that you should be building teams underneath. Now your number twos and your team should be challenging you. You should be an enabler, right? The good news is you can really enable both sides. In fact, I found that the collaboration between the teams were actually way more effective than I had before, because there was less crossover, right? I had less, sort of less chasm between the teams, because in a way, I was able to get both sides and say, hey, you guys are working together on this.
Yeah, I think that ability to get the right things done quicker is absolutely one of the things I've envied about your role at Glasswall, because I've seen you talk about it, seen and heard you talk about it, and I can see that. And sorry, where my head was going was a point Christofer made around setting it was around outputs. So setting the direction, as in the end state that you want to achieve, and then having a collaborative discussion around the table to determine what is the best way to get there. Yeah. Absolutely, all over that, whether that's a small team or a large team. And I would certainly see my role, whether those two seats or indeed the combined seat at the head of the table, saying, ladies and gentlemen, this is what we've got to achieve. How are we going to do it? And by the way, I want to do it yesterday. That absolutely is a sort of direction I would want to set, but not being the technical specialist in the room, or necessarily even definitely not being the brightest person in the room. I want those ideas to come from the team, from the collective. Because if I've built the team properly, I will have people amongst the team who can fill in for my lack of technical knowledge, who will come at things from a different direction to me, because I'm quite process driven. I want things to evolve, but I will take a leap of faith if I think it's the right thing to do, and that can catch people out sometimes. So I sometimes need people to just make sure that we have dotted the I's and crossed the T's to ensure that we don't go down a rabbit hole. So I'm all over that output driven piece, because actually that takes me back to my military days when it was all about what's the mission, what's the objective, what's my boss's intent, what's my boss's boss's intent, how are we going to do that, and what are the dependencies and what's going on around us to make sure we don't stray from our assigned path, or if we do it consciously. And that's actually quite important, I think.
Mario, so here's one for you, right? I know that you were a bit skeptical in the beginning, right, of the conflict of interest, right? But I actually think it's very interesting to have Alan here, because I do. So the worry here is that if the only people who can do this job are the ones that obviously have a strong technical background, who can obviously almost like social engineer their way into that role. And I think, I kind of fall into that category. And I think Mario, you too, and I think Chris, you too, the market that is limited, right? And I think the interesting question is, how can, in fact, talent like Alan, who doesn't have that strong technical, but has a huge amount of stuff, and in the right company, at the right place, is actually way better than, for example, I would be, right? At that level. So how can we kind of start to define this idea that there's a lot of value in getting security professionals to move or even combine those roles, because they bring a lot to the table, and they should be considered when somebody is saying, I want a CTO, I want a VP of engineering. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be a path from security to get in there, but they probably should.
So just to clarify, I don't have concerns around the segregation of duties and all of that. I think the 3 lines of defense model, as Hoff mentioned, we could be here 2 hours talking about it. There's many things wrong with it, right? Particularly not with the model itself, particularly, but on how what it came to mean in organizations, right? We'll not have time to go into that today. But generally, I think it will come down to an issue of management styles, right? So I think I see 2 problems here. One of them is the path dependency within the organizations of how they think about security to begin with, right? So, for instance, going to Hoff's example, if you're coming from a board, an executive team that comes from a highly regulated industry, or their background is in highly regulated industries, just the idea is going to be foreign. Right? There's a path dependence that is probably going to make that not to be a possibility at all. Right? Now, in companies that would consider that to be a possibility, I think the next thing that we go down to is around the management style. Right, because the archetype of the security leader under 3 lines of defense model, right? I'm talking archetypes here, right? So I'm probably going to exaggerate a bit onto one side. It's kind of that person that wants to have that control, right, over something that they don't necessarily understand, but they know that they've got all of these boxes that need to be ticked, and people aren't ticking those boxes. And when that's not happening, then we need to go through these risk acceptance and all of those types of organizational processes to get people made accountable for the decisions they're making, right? So when you've got that type of archetype, I don't think that type of archetype on what good looks like would make for a good CTO.
Yeah,
right.
I agree.
I think a CISO could potentially kind of get away with that type of approach, depending on the company, on the organization. A CTO would not get away with, I think, generally speaking, with that type of approach. So if I was to kind of suggest one way to kind of go through that, would be first looking at management style. If you've got a management style where you're actually eliciting information from a few teams, you know that they're experts at what they do, and you know there are some decisions that it's not you who should be making them, then you're probably going to be fine. Right?
Well, I what's really fascinating about what you said, and I was nodding and smiling and laughing and crying at the same time, is I have worked with and for CISOs who were very, very technical, because they came up through, let's say, sort of the evolution of what security's become from system and network administration, and now it's grown into this whole thing. And they made the leap into the domain of PowerPoint and power and politics, right? Which is what large scale CISOs at big companies end up doing more about, is managing expectations of the board, and if you're a public company, shareholders and regulators, and very little time actually sort of looking into the organization and understanding how it functions at scale. And the challenge is, to Mario's point about leadership style, I think a lot of the reaction that you see from somebody who has made their way up to that position as a CISO, and to your point, Dinis, we talked about sort of not wanting to abandon your technical roots, is if they come from a very command and control background, right, then it becomes a very bureaucratic sort of check the box element. They fit right into this whole separation of duties of first, second, and third line. And ultimately their best instincts for balancing efficiency and effectiveness and innovation and partnership and all of the things that we just spent at the last part of the discussion describing about outcomes and delivering products, takes a second fiddle role to all that bureaucracy. What's fascinating is you put somebody else who doesn't have a command and control background and there's, by the way, that's not a good or bad thing, it's just a difference in style. You put somebody who's much more collaborative, who comes from an environment that, for example, may have come up through security engineering in less highly regulated environments where they had to work with product teams, they had to work with marketing and sales, and actually in many cases directly interact with customers. And you'll find a very different model in some of those cases, even in large companies, about how they go. Like, for example, I love your videos right now on LinkedIn, right? You're sitting down with your CEO, with the VP of HR and human resources, the product person. Like most CISOs, just with that title alone, you would be sitting, if you were the CTO, with the CISO. And so that perspective and that shared sort of fate, if you will, is really fascinating. And so if you looked at my calendar on a day-to-day basis, even though I consider myself reasonably technical on both sides, from a development perspective, engineering, product engineering, and security perspective, I spend the most amount of my time telling my team that looks to me to make the final decision on something, as though I'm going to add value after they've spent 3 months going through rigorous evaluations of technology stacks. I look at it, I ask questions where I have questions, but I let procurement and the GRC folks and everybody else know that that person is the final decision maker. If you need me to sign off on something saying I provided the oversight, fine, but I push back. I trust you. And that's a very different management style. And I spend a lot of my time consulting and talking to the product people, talking with the sales people about what customers are asking for, taking a very outside in view of how people want our products to develop. We've got lots of opportunity with 33 million consumer customers that every day on forums like Reddit, and if you want to humble yourself, just go wade into a Reddit subforum about your product. You'll find out really quickly about what people think. Knowing both sides of the story, right? I spend a lot of time really thinking about that. That takes zero technical skill whatsoever. That takes a level of empathy and understanding of the process, and to your point, Alan, to some extent, the outcome and the mission. It's just a different lens by which I'm squinting at the mission. And so I'll be honest, I think you contradicted yourself by describing exactly what you could do if you wanted to, but then you brought in the whole command and control thing. And I think a lot of it is comfort, right? To me, look, empathy and vulnerability are an important part of being a good leader. I have said many times the same things you've said. Why? Because I felt comfortable in my security role, because I can always fall back on, well, I'm the control function. It's really a very different experience when the success of a product is inclusive of security, but also usability and scalability and all the other ilities that go along with it. And that's what I find attractive. There are so many people, I think, that have this. I mean, just look at security alone and look at how many people are just in our security community or industry have imposter syndrome just about becoming a CISO. Why? Because, oh, I'm a red teamer, I'm a pen tester, I do malware reverse engineering. I couldn't possibly be a CISO. Really? Why? Where do you think the people that are CISOs now? Our industry is barely even an industry at this point, right? Meaning relative to maturity. Like all of those people came from, whether it was guarding nuclear weapons or reverse engineering malware or looking at page 10 on Hacking Exposed. Point is, like, we gatekeep ourselves. And and I'm not picking on you, Alan, because but I love the juxtaposition of the fact that I think there are, for every one of us, there's 1,000 of you that think that they couldn't or shouldn't. But those are two different things. So I'm sorry for picking on you. I don't even know you, but I
look, everybody has imposter syndrome. I have imposter syndrome.
I do.
It doesn't last very long, but I still have it. Right?
Yeah, every day.
Still go through it, right? And actually, look, I'm really trying to hire now across the security spectrum, because I think I want to bring a lot of people that might have imposter syndrome. And now I'm trying to create an environment where they can apply to it. But Mario, you had some questions to ask.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask Hoff and yourself a question. So because you've both had roles, kind of senior executive roles that are just security, and now also the experience of being having both hats, what would you say are differences that you saw in terms of the qualities of the interactions between your direct reports as peers? Right. When your direct reports bring issues to you, are there differences in how you saw that people bring issues or try to solve them themselves? So can you share a bit of your experience in that regard?
That's a good question. How do you want to go first?
Please. No, I said you should go first. Yeah.
I don't know if there's a big difference. I think I will go down to personality. I think my style of management promotes a certain type of feedback and a certain type of team interaction, right? So I don't think that there was a remarkable difference between the CISO, CTO. I think the difference is there's definitely a different mentality, right? You know, in security, we're trying to protect stuff. When CTO, we're trying to build stuff, right? So I definitely feel that that has an impact. But in terms of direct reports, I don't feel, you know, that's, you know, the kind of activities that I push through the team is just probably doing more at scale, right? I think that was the thing I found, you know, from a CTO point of view. We were building more things, but no, I don't think it's a very good question, right? I don't think I have.
Sorry, I think I might not have clarified my question in the best way. So I was so, for instance, in companies that are highly bureaucratic, then often things that happen between the CISO function and CTO function end up always kind of being reported up to you, so that you can go talk with another peer and all of that. I was talking more in terms of those types of dynamics, on how people kind of address the problems that they find on a day-to-day basis, as part of each of them trying to optimize for the things they were hired for.
Well, I guess there's a selective bias here, right? Because I think what I'd done would have not worked in a bureaucratic organization, right? So, you know, but my instinct is always to connect, right? I think I have an instinct to get people to talk to each other. I feel that's my job, is to get, so the amount of times I says talk to, in fact, the interesting thing, what I would say is I don't have, for example, a data point to say that is the security team not talking to the engineering team. What I would say when they don't talk is it's consistent, right? Is the engineering team not talking to the engineering team, right? Like, I always like this thing where this guy says, well, we don't know what's going on. I'm like, yeah, but you know, the right arm of the engineering team also doesn't know what the left arm of the engineering team is happening, right? I think you need to put a lot of effort into getting that communication to occur, right? I remember when I started, like the first floor didn't know what the bottom floor was even doing, right? It's like they work in the same building, right? So it's almost like it's only when I push people to blog about it, to talk about the stuff. So, for example, I think lack of communication will occur, you know, like it's easy to blame security and technology and say that's the lack of communication problem, but it's not, right? I guarantee you look inside those functions, and if there's lack of communication between the functions, there's also going to be lack of communication inside the functions, right? And I think in this case, I feel, I think what happens is you then get a mandate, right? It's actually, in an interesting way, having somebody with those two roles does clear up the communication channels, because there's less, like you said, less different points of view on how to do things. Especially more and more that I realize that part of the job of security is to let the business be secure, right? I tell the business our job is to make it safe, not secure, because it's easy. Like SNCC is a good example, right? I sometimes find myself telling teams that that's not relevant. Although yes, looks red, but actually this is much more problematic than that, right? So again, in security, sometimes you can go for the stuff you can measure. And I think having accountability for the deliverables, makes you understand much better what matters and what doesn't. And I think, so again, I don't have a data point. I know maybe Hoff, you have data points, like do your teams, do your direct reports behave a bit differently because of the different functions to you?
So I have an unfair answer, in as much as the engineering and development teams are aligned based on a team topology's organizational dynamic, and the security teams that are embedded and aligned to each of the stream aligned teams that are focused on developing the products are incredibly well integrated and thoughtful contributors to, from cradle to grave, the development of product. Now, what's interesting about that statement is the traditional juxtaposition then of the sort of DevSecOpsy organizational function and who they would talk to, who are really sort of their peers in the engineering organization, to what many would describe as their traditional corporate security piece, which is usually where the Department of No comes from, right? So just to be fair. And one of the things that I am working very hard on is, besides providing a normal HR looking view of corporate security versus product security, and I hope the HR people don't ever tune into this, right? But the dirty little secret is, at the end of the day, I don't think of them as being different. Now, the proof will be in the pudding of how well we think about this converged set of capabilities, enabling teams, complicated subsystem teams, platform teams, et cetera, from a security perspective, because each plays an important role. So to your direct question, in large organizations that I've been a part of, it's highly compartmentalized. And it is, if I had to frame it in that way, the developers and engineering would be talking about the art of the possible, and security would be talking about, no, that's impossible. And unfortunately, most of that, no, that's impossible, quote, comma, you can't do that, does end up in some compromise when done right around, but you can do this. But again, it's driven mostly by compliance, because that's how, as it moves further up the stack, you get measured, unfortunately, whether it's red, yellow, or green, right? And those RAG charts are terrible, because at the end of the day, you can explain away a lot of stuff, but then people start using words like risk and throwing around that word without actually being able to measure it, because it's all sort of qualitative. And so let me go back to your question, because I started to ramble. At the end of the day, large companies are very segmented and fragmented, and sets up that juxtaposition of a versus scenario. In the organization I'm in now, I'm delighted to say that we care about our customers and the experience they have. And everybody understands and has empathy around the fact that that is what we are focused on. I could not have this role in the place I came from, just because of how massive it is, and how, and I say this with all due respect, bureaucratic it happens to be, given the industry it's in, which is finance, right? Trust me, I have lots of regulatory impacts that I have to plan for, but I do think that it's the combination of the size of the organization, the industry they're in, the level of bureaucracy and expectations, the leadership support that you have at the top of the house. So Dinis, you're sitting with the CEO of your company, interviewing them about the value that security and technology in your combined office brings. That's special. That doesn't happen very often, right? And that's a key piece that we're sort of missing from the conversation here, is you have to have a maniacally devoted executive team who cares about the shared outcomes. Not that people don't, but are able to express it and also work collaboratively, because all four of us could be massively exceptional in our roles. But if we're seen as just another competing appendage in this giant enterprise organization, we're not going to have the level of collaboration that we want. So,
Yeah.
you know,
The thing I would say more and more, especially in cyber today, you want to work for a company like that, right? I feel that, okay, this depends on where you are in your career, of course,
yeah,
but I feel that more and more, if you're working for a company that doesn't have that attitude, you're missing a trick, right? Because there's a lot of companies out there, right? There's a lot of companies out there that are doing the right thing. They're focusing on customer. They're asking the right questions. They just, they might need guidance, but they are a great place. So I definitely would say that, you know, if you're not in a place like the one that, Hoff just described, hey, it's a great market out there. Look, I'm hiring.
We're hiring simultaneously. I call dibs.
Yeah. So, there you go, right? So, oh yeah, we can play rock, paper, scissors, Zoom, see how that works. But oh yeah, look, if you have a chance to work for Hoff, absolutely, right? That would be a great game changer. But
Dinis,
yeah,
can I jump in? Sorry, because I'm conscious of the time, and we've just lost two from our audience.
Yeah.
We've actually got a question from
let's do that
Az, I think. And I'm going to tackle it with a bit of a reach back. So I have adapted my style.
Can you just say the question?
So the question point in here is about, do you expect to move to a military stance InfoSec in the wake of the Ukraine war? CISO military is a very different space. So not surprisingly, I think I have something to say on that topic, but I wanted to just tackle the command and control to consultative collaborative, because that's how I've shifted. My first 10 to 15 years in the military were very much in a command and control space. But actually, my last 5 years were much more consultative, because I got much more into the operational and almost into the strategic space about, right, these are the problems, how are we going to tackle them? There isn't a book answer. So I couldn't go back to the policy set and say, well, that's what we should do, because it didn't fit. And that's what led me into what has mostly been a consulting role in my now 16 years in the commercial space. And sorry, forgive me, I just had to translate my civvy street to commercial, because that's how I still think about it. But to Az's point, no, I don't think a shift to a more militaristic stance is right for most commercial outfits, because they're not the same. If you're a vendor or if you're a defense manufacturer, then possibly. But for most others, that is not the language, that is not the stance that will be understood by either your staff, your colleagues, or your customers. So you have to think about that. When I read NCSC alert this morning about, given what's going on in Ukraine, we want outfits to be on a higher security status. I recognize that from my military perspective, but for most commercial outfits, it means nothing to them, because they don't switch their controls based on a bikini alert state, to use the old language. That's not how they operate, and nor should they. If you're working with an outfit in the Ukraine or close in that region, you should be thinking about duty of care of your staff and your suppliers, and where are you dependent on any critical components out of the Ukraine? As for instance, the VW group has found that's where their wiring looms are coming from, and their whole production space is impacted by that. So absolutely, you should be thinking about the effects, and I'm not going to effects-based warfare, because that's a different topic entirely. But I don't think putting more folks with my background into CISO positions is the right move, because it won't work in a commercial outfit most of the time. I can't give orders even to my own team in the way that I could have done in the military, for two reasons. One, I don't have that same level of authority. You know, I can't, sorry, and it is on my back wall, but you can't see it. I can't point to my Queen's Commission and say, you do because I told you to. That does not work in Civvy Street. That does not work in the commercial world. You've got to appeal to, actually, to some extent, people's self-interest. What's in it for them is a very different needs a very different management style than the military command and control one. And I've had to adapt my style to match that.
I wonder how much of that is cultural, Alan, because I'll tell you that in the US, the militarization and fetishization of military terminology, organizational structures, and staffing models in large companies in the US, everybody thinks they're, they take what they saw on CSI Cyber or, Cyber SWAT, name your famous show. And there is an awful lot of leadership that comes from military backgrounds here, much like your military. And they most absolutely not only run their shops the way you described is not appropriate in corporate America, but get away with it because of how highly regulated and structured it is and how appealing it sounds to have that very classical mission-oriented structure of, do or die. Literally, we use adversary. All the vocabulary is tailored around the militarization efforts. And so what's fascinating is that it'd be another topic for another time, but I see, like, there are lots of people, lots of people that came from Department of Defense, the intelligence agencies. My operations team, for example, in one of my employees was staffed with former special operations teams, CIA interrogators on my insider threat teams. I mean, you name it, we've got it. And I wonder how different that is between, let's say, the UK and the US, because right now there's a lot of people who are running around really energized and excited anytime bad things happen overseas, because they get to sort of flex some of that attitude. So another fascinating topic I'm glad you brought up, but I think we're out of time, unfortunately.
Look, it's I think my AirPods just died. I think there's an angle here around numbers. So I absolutely recognize what you're describing in the US. Your recently active veteran community, I think, is in the, did I read something like 10 million supported through the Veterans Department? Something of that order. Yeah, we've got 4 million veterans in the UK, but that's up to and including 104-year-olds. So that's not really in the same scale.
Yeah.
And on continental Europe, I think the number's smaller still. Albeit some of them still have conscription models as opposed to all volunteer. So there can be a separation, or there can be a difference depending upon the model that their military operates. I think that's one of the reasons why the Ukraine has been able to do as well as it has done, is that they actually had a conscription model. So they had a degree of basic military skills in a larger population than, say, Belgium would have proportionately. And similarly in Finland, Sweden, and indeed Switzerland, they still have a level of militaristic skills in the general populace, which is actually out of proportion to their standing military. So there are exceptions, but if you look at this from the business side of it, those people who come in with the militaristic language, the jingoism, and I am quite deliberately using that word, it doesn't work very well for very long, because it actually alienates the people who haven't served. And that's not really the relationship that you want to set up. Not at the board level with the non-execs, the execs, the real power brokers within a company. You want them to welcome you into a conversation, not be wary of you dominating it. Cool. But that's a cultural discussion. I think that's well away from a CTO CISO piece.
Yeah.
Good point.
All right. Just to wrap up, Mario, any final thoughts? Or
No, that was it. It was a great panel. It's very nice to be here with all of you. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Well, brilliant. So
Same.
thanks everybody, and let's do another one with another similar topic next time.
Yeah. Nice meeting you, Alan. Thanks for letting me pick on you.